We have historical preservations probably 4 to 5 times a year, generally the first Monday of the month, but they kind of wanted to set it up for voting last week, so they wouldn't let us have it. So anyway, we're here tonight. We've got Barb Hooverman with us that's done the research and will be doing the presentation. Doing the research is going to be a lot easier for us in the near future because we are in the process of getting all the Osceola Suns scanned. We have gotten a grant and we've got some donations. So we're at about 11,000 that we've brought in, going for 22,000. So I've got the hat here, so if you like these presentations, we're just kind of looking for a little bit of more donations to reach the rest of it so we can get all of the papers scanned. They are in the process of doing the first 10 years right now. So that's way back in the 1800s that they'll be doing, which is going to be fascinating to when we finally get them, that we can start searching them. I don't think the three of us will sleep at all the first week they come in. Barb is a Historical Society board member, and Colleen is a Historical Society board member, and so am I. And then we've got Mike Addy also is. There's train ride brochures here, and walking tour brochures here, and membership applications. So, bathrooms are down the hall. You can move your chairs around any way you want to see the screens. There's one here, one there, one over there, and one little one down here. So wherever you can see the screens the best. And with that, it's all yours, Barb.
All right. Well, this has been fun to put together. There's a whole lot more going on out there than I ever knew. So without further ado, Troutmere is a name a lot of people aren't going to recognize, but when we get into it, you'll find out what that's all about. When you go out to the hatchery, come on now, why are we not moving? Oh, too far. There we go. And you drive in. It's pretty much the same road it's been since anything's been out there. And the first thing you notice, the sound of the wind in the pines, the sound of the water, wherever you go, you just hear this gurgling water. So in the beginning, kind of, sort of, as Jeff, who's the current manager at the hatchery, pointed out, our history doesn't go back real far here as far as European immigrants go. We only go back to about 1845. There's a whole lot more going on before that. The Chippewa and the Sioux were the Indian tribes who were here, but if you notice, there are 2 disputed zones, and we're kind of right in the middle of them, so things got a little hairy in our neck of the woods. The river bottoms, which are pictured here, would have been the no man's land between them, and part of Peaslee Slough. There's a creek that runs down, makes a Peaslee Lake and a Rice Lake. It's down in there. There's a kind of a horse-shaped berm on one of those islands out there. And Jeff's theory is that may have been where the Indians kind of made their camp, because it would have been high, it would have been up from the floodwaters, and it's near a place where you can get up the hill from the river. And there aren't a lot of places along here where you can do that because it's all bluffs. So it made kind of a nice little access point. There are quite a few, or were quite a few, burial mounds still around on County Road S. This is a map of some of them. A lot of them have been destroyed or excavated. It used to be okay to do that. People didn't think anything of it. There were people here for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's still, like behind the little schoolhouse that's out on S, there's still one big burial mound that you can see real clearly. So then, Samuel Close, he's an interesting man. He was the first known European settler to put up, to lay claim to the land out there. He and his wife made a claim for a mill at the fall of the creek. The same year that William Kent and Mahoney and the rest of them set up the Cascade Mill downtown. So 1844, 1845, that's when Samuel Close was up there. But Mrs. Close died in 1847. We don't know where she's buried. That would be fun to find out. And shortly after that, Mr. Close set off to file his claim, his final papers for this property. And he had to go to Prairie du Chien to do that. And you have to keep in mind, at this point, there was not a road to Prairie du Chien, or Dresser for that matter. So he just struck off on foot through the woods, probably followed the river, and probably hoped he'd know when he got there. So the thing is, we don't know if he ever did. Nobody ever heard from him again up here, so we don't know what happened to Samuel Close. But it is Close's Creek that runs through the fish hatchery, so he at least left his name on that. He was not the only person out there. After he left, Samuel Thompson and his family made up most of the neighborhood. Now, this map is a little deceiving because for a long time, Highway 35 came from the lower left there, and then it turned and went up what is now Coney Road S. 35 didn't go to Dresser at that point, so go up the White Road there. Samuel Thompson was there and his wife Isabella. They moved in, and his brother Allenson came also. They were in 1855. They were on either side of the road, and two of their sisters were also out there, Mrs. Daniel Mears, and they lived directly across the road from the fish hatchery entrance. So on the first slide where I was standing looking in, if I turned around, that would have been the Mears property. That's where they lived. And Mears went on to become a big deal in Osceola. That's a whole other program. But they were there. And then his other sister was Wealthy Ann Prentice, and her son, Worthy Prentice, is one of our local historians. We have a lot of good information because he was paying attention to what was going on out there. Now, Sam Thompson was officially a farmer, but he was also an Indian trader. So there were several Native American families who wintered on the creek out there, and he would send his oldest son along with them when they were out doing their trap lines in the winters. And the son would bring all his donkeys and everything loaded with groceries and supplies for them, and then in turn he'd bring the pelts back. So that worked well for him. Worthy went on in some of his books to tell some of the other interactions that they had with the native people there. And originally, I was going to include that here, but I quickly found out there's far too much of that, so we'll have to do that another day. So Sam and his brother had this dam on Close's Creek, and they used it as a cane mill, which I had never heard of a cane mill. They made syrup out there. In 1881, they produced more than 3,200 gallons of syrup, which retailed for 50 cents a gallon. Another nice feature of that dam was that Sam could shut it off, and if trout swam up the stream, he could shut the dam off, trap them in there, catch the trout, and raise them. So he didn't have to do much. He just had to take care of them until the babies were big enough that he could release them again. He was selling trout to people in the cities part of the time. Fish he caught at 5 a.m. once the train came to Osceola, he could have to the cities by 10:30. Minnesota law didn't allow you to do that year-round, but Wisconsin did. So he was making money hand over fist selling these fish to the people on the train and the people in the cities. And he said, if you came out yourself, people could come out and catch trout themselves. He charged 50 cents a pound to catch them, limited the amount taken, and he promised that you could catch them from 1/2 to 2 pounds if you know how to trout, which I didn't realize trouting was a thing. But so he made this 8-acre pond, and he had a smaller 1.5-acre pond nearby, and that served as the spawning grounds. So he kept the little fish there until they got big enough. The little ones are the fry, the real small ones. And he intended to build further dams and further ponds further down the creek, which was about 1.5 miles long. He didn't have any rearing houses. Like I say, all he had to do was provide a place for them to not get eaten until they were big enough. So, in 1875, Sam Thompson was looking to sell his 180 acres that he had out there, including the trout streams. He was about 62 by this time, and he died in 1889. Life expectancy at that time was only 50, so he was doing pretty well. Finally, in 1885, along came E.F. Drake. He was from the cities, and he had built the first railroad in Minnesota from St. Paul to St. Anthony in 1862. That was the St. Paul and Pacific. He moved to St. Paul in 1864, was instrumental in building the St. Paul and Sioux City Railroad in 1872. He was a member of the state senate. He was a director of the Merchants National Bank, a director of the St. Paul Trust, a member of the Executive Council of the Minnesota Historical Society, president of it for a while, and a member of the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce, and he invested in lumber mills and stone quarries and livestock. So he was busy. He did not have time to run the fish hatchery. So when German immigrant Gustav Hansen came, people in Germany had been raising trout for a long time, and he knew how to do it. So he came and he managed the property with gusto. And he also began rearing mastiffs and some other kinds of dogs there at the Osceola kennels. One of Mr. Drake's sons, Harry, actually became involved. He followed in his father's footsteps on a lot of things, but he really kind of liked the dogs. So it was his thing to take Don Caesar, that's this particular one, and travel the country doing dog shows with him. He made, in 1 year, he won titles in Milwaukee, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Rhode Island, and New Jersey. And by 1888, the dog was valued at $1,000, which in today's money, that's more than $27,000. So he was a big deal. Harry was busy with other stuff. He was also one of the first members and the Commodore of the White Bear Yacht Club. So he had his own kind of clientele that came out. Somewhere along the line, for sure by 1887, they started calling it Troutmere. And in 1887, remember where Daniel Mears lived, right across the street from the hatchery. Jane Amory was a school teacher from St. Croix Falls, and she's the daughter of William Amory that the city is named after. She would cut through from the Mears house where she was staying to the little school out on S, and they fell in love. And in 1888, they got married. By February of that year, they were advertising their brook trout for sale for stocking ponds and lakes, selling to the Northern Pacific Railroad dining cars and the better hotels. And the Osceola Depot, being pretty new, was really kept busy with that. And they still had the dogs. And this is kind of what Troutmere looked like. I said I should have had you colorize some of these. That would have been fun. Troutmere got to be a summertime mecca for people from the Twin Cities and Chicago and other places. Cities like that were hot and smelly. They had breweries, they had slaughterhouses, they had railroads. It was not a fun place to be in the city. There was no air conditioning. So the people that could afford it liked to come out to places like Osceola. If you've ever heard of Seven Pines up by Lewis, that's another place that people like to go. Lake Minnetonka, that's how that got to be such a big deal. All these people trying to get out of the city during the summer. So Gustav and Jane started taking in guests, and they built the big house that you see there. You notice there's 2 roofs. There's 2 buildings just the same, and the one in the back is the guest house. So they would all eat together in the communal dining room, and Mrs. Hansen made popovers. And there were some wealthy people from the cities called the Delatries. He was a lawyer. They built their own cottage out there because they liked it, and they named it the Popover Cottage. There were other cottages up on the hill. They had about half a dozen of them. I'm not sure what all these buildings are exactly. I think this was probably the ice house. This may have been one of the cottages up here on the hill. So we'll get later on, I'll show you kind of how that figures in with what it looks like today. So these people would come, they'd spend a weekend, they'd spend 6 weeks, they'd bring their governesses, they'd bring their nannies, they'd bring the whole shooting match and come out and just hang out where they could have quiet, clean air to breathe. This one you can just see the second house peeking out behind the first one. And of course, it's the artesian wells that make all this possible, or the artesian springs. We believe this is Troutmere Hansen, Gustav Hansen. We don't have anything that's actually labeled him. They're all like presumed to be, but he's very comfortable on these and he's always dressed pretty much the same. So in this one, notice the kids down on the docks. They all came and watched the fish and just had a good time. Among the names on the guest register was that of Lieutenant Leopold Amory, who came to America from England, and he took time to look up his cousin Jane. He was a close friend of Winston Churchill, his classmate at Oxford, so he was our international star. And besides the Delatries and the Drakes, many big names from the cities, the Gotzians from Gotzian Shoes, even James J. Hill, the empire builder from the railroads, came out to Troutmere. This is Anna Held. She was a vaudeville star who was not married with Flo Ziegfeld, but was living with him at that time. She came and she came in her private train car because the hotels here were not up to her standards. So Mr. Hansen picked him up at the station like he did with all his guests. And the glowing newspaper reports that her publicist put out, they're actually pretty funny, claimed that she wanted to buy the place and that she had indulged in her fabled milk baths in Troutmere's claw-footed tub. Miss Anna Held will probably leave Minneapolis with an investment of $22,000 for 300 acres of land near Osceola, where she will erect a large modern hotel with ornamental lawns, walks, improve the roads, and make the place a summer habitation for tourists and fishing parties, which kind of already was, but most of that was just overblown hype. Her publicist was really creative. But she did buy a big dog from Gustav and took it home with her. She found out in a hurry that she wasn't cut out to have a large dog. So the dog came back, and he just lived out his life at Troutmere. Oh, and Mr. Ziegfeld, they ended up breaking up, but he went on to marry Billy Burke, who played Glinda the Good Witch in The Wizard of Oz. So I thought that was kind of cool. This is kind of cool, too. By 1891, another son of Mr. Drake's, Alexander, that's him in the corner, was kind of overseeing the property. Very trendy for the big bankers. They'd come out and smoke their cigars and play cards, and there are rumors that there were dancing girls and the whole shebang. The root cellar on the property that's still there, actually they found out recently was actually the wine cellar, so that's where they were keeping their wine. And in 1892, Mr. Drake died, and that's when Hansons bought the property. Alexander Drake, when there was a financial panic in 1893, he got scared. He moved west and founded the city of Bend, Oregon. So that's a little bit more of what Troutmere's like. These are the ones I wish were in color. That would be fun. What I found out is that when the hotel season closed in the fall, then Troutmere was the host for local events. So the people from here would have balls and whatever social events they had. That's one of the things when we get the papers we'll be able to look up. But since we don't have a date or anything, we don't know what to look for yet. Some of the things that are left over from that time include this little garage that was built in 1894. It still looks very similar, just got a new roof. And Sonny Leash, whose father Louis worked out there, and Uncle Freddie as well, remembers it sitting back behind the main house. That's where it is. It's still in use. Grace Bloom's articles, she wrote a series of them for the bicentennial, put them in the newspaper each week, something about Osceola history. And she said that only stone foundations show where guest cottages once stood, and a big empty concrete hillside reservoir is a reminder of the earlier water system. And I think that is probably the reservoir up on the top of the hill. There are other foundations out there too. This one here where you can see Jeff standing forms the basis for a chicken coop now. Sonny remembers it having been a workshop. We don't know for sure what was out there. So, in 1893, Elizabeth Amory, who was Jane's niece, came to live with them. Her mother, they had been living out in Spokane, Washington, Seattle, and her mother died of typhoid, and her father was distraught, wasn't sure what to do with this child. He packed up and headed for the gold rush, so he left and died not long afterwards. So Bessie came and lived with her uncle and aunt at Troutmere. She was 5. She helped pick berries for the dinners, picking vegetables. Later on, she waited tables. She played with the dogs, and sometimes they would let her hook them up like this. That's not actually her, but she had them hooked up to play with them. And when Bessie grew up, she got to be very well educated. She got a master's in home economics. She taught in colleges in Baltimore, California, and Washington. She traveled the world, and she helped start the 4-H program and the women's clubs in Wisconsin. Back to the fish. By 1901, all the members of the Minnesota State Game and Fish Commission came out and were more than surprised with the results of their visit. They were very impressed with what was going on in Osceola. Wisconsin was a little bit ahead of Minnesota in this respect. They kind of had the fish thing figured out. So they bought a bunch of trout fry from Mr. Hansen, brought them back to Minnesota to get theirs started. So he was making a very good business of them. Wisconsin people also came and visited. I'll show you a little bit more on that in a while. And some of the well-to-do Osceola citizens, like Charles Ladd, who lives up, well, it's now kind of the horse property. He was buying fish and stocking them in the ponds and the creeks. He put them in Osceola Creek. He put them in Bone Lake up by Luck. So they would buy them every year and spread them around. 1906, this is more of Gustav Hansen. I still really think that's him. It's almost got to be. I just think that's cool. Okay, so if you visit the hatchery today, the flagpole would be approximately where the windmill is. I hope you can see the windmill. It's kind of hard in this one. And the 5-bay garage sits about where the barn is. Now the reservoir was just up the hill from the barn. So if you look at this one, you can kind of compare them. There's the flagpole right by the house. There's the little shed from 1894. And this is the new garage that's replaced the barn. But they're all kind of right in the same place. I'm interested in this right here because I can't find anything. It's almost got to be some kind of a rearing house or something, but I can't find what exactly that is. But anyway, this is how it looks today. So in 1905, Mrs. Hansen's mother, Sarah Amory, also came to live with them until she died in 1912. And May Harding, who is another of our dedicated local historians, reports that the Hansens also took in a niece of Gustav Hansen, who came from Germany. They helped her get Americanized. They sent her to school. She graduated from St. Joseph's Hospital in St. Paul in 1908 with a nursing degree, and then she went west as well. A lot of people from here ended up in Washington, and she went out and became a nurse in Washington State. There was another uncle out there. At some point along in here, on the river side of County S, because the hatchery was on both sides of the road, a power plant was built, and that provided all the lights for Troutmere. They were off the grid before there was a grid, so I thought that was kind of cool. Electricity did come to Osceola in 1908 with names like Charles Ladd and his wife Prudence. She was the president of the company. Tewksbury, Hill Scudder, and Bloom were running the show there. That came out of the mill and elevator company downtown. So the waterfall that we see here was about 1/3 of the way down to the battery, and Troutmere was a self-contained facility, generated their own electricity in a power plant just below there. It was used to light the buildings and grounds, run the electric grinders for preparing fish food and pumping water, and the discharge then from the generators went down the hill to the lower battery where the water was warmed enough to reach 65 degrees, and that worked out very well for them. So by 1912, Bessie was home from college, recovering from her second bout of scarlet fever. It's kind of funny because she's supposed to be homesick, but Gustav and Jane went to Arizona for the winter and left her in charge of Troutmere. So she ran it with the help of a maid, Dora, and possibly Adolph Pepper. We're not sure if he was there yet, not officially, but he may have been around. The bathroom that they had indoor was a rare household luxury. Didn't freeze because they had electric heat, but Grace Bloom remembers Bessie had to wrap warm flannels around the pipes to get the ones in the kitchen to thaw out. So, And on this one, yes, you can see the main road is still going to S. Even in 1914, the little dotted line is kind of where 35 will go as we know it. If you wanted to get to Dresser at this point, you had to come up and then turn on the Fish Hatchery Road and come out kind of by Hope Church up on top of the hill. So, in 1920, a hatchery started in St. Croix Falls. And in 1920, the state of Wisconsin, 1912 it started. 1920, the state acquired it. It was the first hatchery in the state program that used rearing ponds to grow the trout a little bit bigger instead of releasing only the delicate fingerlings, the smaller ones. Bigger than the fry, but not big. You can still see the terraced raceways if you go to Interstate Park and walk down through the North Campground. There's a little spur that goes up to the St. Croix Hatchery. You can get in there and do tours, but along the way you'll pass these empty raceways. It's right below where the Dairy Queen used to be. They said by 1924 there were 6 or 8 private hatcheries that were providing trout for restaurants and also selling them to the state for stocking purposes. Hudson, Star Prairie, and St. Croix were among them, but Osceola was the leader in fat, luscious trout. I've never had trout. I need to eat some now. This is really hard to see, and I apologize for that. 1918 was World War I. We don't really know for sure if the hatchery stayed open or if it was closed, but I can't find any military record for Gustav, and he would have been in his 60s by that time anyway. So my thought is he probably stuck around and took care of the fish, and they stayed open. 1925, Adolph Pepper began working at Troutmere officially, which by this time is the largest privately owned hatchery on the continent. Gustav Hansen was getting close to 70, so in July he leased his hatchery to the state of Wisconsin for $3,000 a year. The following year, Chris Faulkner came from Bayfield to serve as a manager, and Gustav and Jane retired. Before the hatchery was turned over to the state, though, the popover cottages that the Delatries had built was taken apart, numbered, and reassembled by Eric Klung, who was one of the guys that built the Baptist church, did all the stonework on it. And he lived right out in the neighborhood with the hatchery. And they built it on the southwest corner of Deer Lake. Where the Howard Blandings are, they were next door to the Howard Blandings. It was bulldozed eventually in the 80s or 90s. The remains still lie in the woods there. Sadly, in 1928, the Hansens made their home pretty much year-round at the cottage on Deer Lake, but they lived in Osceola and they traveled extensively the rest of the time. But during the winter of 1928, while they were in Baltimore visiting Bessie, Mr. Hansen suffered a heart attack and died. He and Jane are buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, so if you go in and see the big Seaman stone with the angel that we just put up last year, they're just below that. So Hansen's on one side, Bessie's on the back. In 1927, and I don't have a picture for this, which is maybe okay, I tried to find a drilling truck. But they were doing some drilling equipment out there. When they were moving it from there to Farmington, they were testing the brakes. This guy was standing on the ground. He ended up getting run over and was killed. And I don't know if there's a typo in his name or what, but I can't find any other mention of William Gore. He's the man that we lost there. So Jane, once Gustav died, she kept herself busy. She lived another 15 years, and she made a good use of her time. She was involved in the Red Cross and the FHA and the Women's Club, and was like founding members of a lot of these other societies in the town. Besides that, she spent a lot of time visiting in Baltimore with Bessie and her Aunt Frances, who was in California at the time. She spent a considerable amount of time each summer at Torch Hill, where she hired a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, and a chauffeur. Some of the neighbors felt that Mrs. Hansen was putting on airs, and they called her Lady Jane. Not necessarily the most popular woman out there. This is how the Wisconsin Commission traveled to check on their fish. This is the Badger #2 fish car. So kind of like Anna held. They didn't want the hotels. The state was making great use of the resources they had. 12 members of the Wisconsin Commission came out by auto, so they drove out, but they slept each night in the fish car, which I thought was hysterical. So in September 29, Losi Stewart, he came on and was advertising bids for a concrete and glass rearing house that would house 100 fish troughs. The Osceola Sun reported that the local hatchery is said to be about as ideally located as possible, with plenty of pure cold spring water, the kind in which trout do best. The buildings are inadequate, of course, but if the state exercises its option and purchases the place from the Gustav Hansen estate, as is no doubt intended, the plant will in all probability be rapidly improved and added to. 5 Michigan fishermen visited the hatchery a short time ago, and they went into ecstasies over the ideal water conditions there. They stated that they had visited many hatcheries and that none of them compared to the local one as far as natural fitness is concerned. Fish produced there seem to also have an advantage over others, as they reach much greater size by the time they're ready to be released than do those raised at other hatcheries. So they're going to make this great big rearing house for them, mostly of glass, skylights in the roof, very fancy. But then, the house at Troutmere burned down. Mrs. Fred Leash was living there at the time in a separate house, and at 9 o'clock she saw lights flickering and called Losi, who was at an Oddfellows meeting in town along with her husband Fred and Magnus Peterson, who was also a hatchery employee. And then she ran to rouse Mrs. Stewart and their 2 girls, Artis and June. Their son Val was a Boy Scout. He was in a meeting in New Richmond that night, so he was not involved. Losi and several of the Oddfellows came out. The fire department came out with their chemicals. They were able to retrieve a few pieces of furniture, and no one was seriously hurt, but the house was a total loss. It was believed to have started in the wiring and burned enough to kill several of the mature trees around it. Jane Hansen still technically owned the property at this time, and she was visiting in Baltimore, but she agreed to rebuild. So the Stewarts moved into the old hotel building in the interim, and eventually a new house was built. That's this one that still stands today as the manager's house. Okay, so Chris Faulkner left. He moved back to Bayfield to serve as the foreman there. And Losi Stewart had come in from the hatchery at Wild Rose, and he stayed there until his retirement in 1960. Louis Leash was on the payroll by this time, and his brother Freddie, who had been at the Netco Lake location down by Madison, was here for sure by 1930. It's kind of hard to pin down an actual start time there. The Leash brothers and Adolph Pepper each proudly reported 45 years of employment for Troutmere Hansen and the state of Wisconsin. And this is a picture of Mr. Leash, Freddie, when he was down at NEPCO. The Conservation Department in 1933 was employing between 16 and 21 men at the Osceola Hatchery under the Civil Works program. So there was a lot going on out there. Also, about the same time, 1933, sportsmen's clubs are a big deal when it comes to hatcheries because they helped stock the fish. They had cooperative ponds and that sort of thing. And the Osceola Rod and Gun Club was formed in 1933 in November. So far, this is all I've got, and I did contact the Rod and Gun Club, haven't got more yet. Roy Nelson, Stanley Hawkinson, Losi Stewart, Gene Bile, Robert Soderberg, and Charles Anderson were the founding members. So they would go on to do quite a lot of work for the hatchery. In 1935, they were expecting record production of fry. That happened several years. 1926 was also a record-breaking year for them. The sportsmen's groups were overwhelmingly supporting the purchase of the hatchery. The lease was going to run out with Mrs. Hansen, so they were pressuring the legislature to approve that. They were going to build 4 new sub-hatcheries for rearing muskies. Losi Stewart, though, they had given each of them jobs to do. He was in charge of rescuing operations for the state hatcheries, so when things would flood and the fish would get stuck in little ponds outside the river, Losi and his crew would go out and catch these fish and put them back in the water so they didn't all just drown when they dried out. And in May, the request for $35,000 to purchase the 240-acre property is passed unanimously by the Senate. So it's now a state hatchery. Changes are coming though. Sonny remembers when the raceways were all wood and the guys would move the trout around from one to another using a yoke and buckets similar to these. I confess I stole that picture from Polk County again. It's actually a man in Clayton carrying his milk to the creamery, but it's the same idea. They had buckets full of fish on their shoulders, almost 3 feet high and big around. In the rearing house, after the fish spawned, the men would put the eggs in big trays, about 2 by 3 feet, 8 or 9 inches deep or so, and stack them 6 to 8 high. And then the water would run through them and keep them fresh, and then the water would go back over them, was discharged to the river. The state program put up employee homes about this time, moved them in from other places. Then the employees could watch over the place better. When there were heavy rains, the guys would have to get up and leave their homes at midnight or 3 a.m. to clean the screens that separated the different parts of the raceways. Otherwise, leaves and debris would clog them up, and the flumes would flood, and there'd be trout all over the place. This is one of the screens that's still there. They still need to pull them out when it rains, or they back up and flood. And the black nets over the top are to keep birds and other little critters from helping themselves to the fish. Okay, so this is the building that's there now. This was WPA days, when President Roosevelt had his plan to get everybody working. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, those boys did all the work on the rock walls up at Interstate, the building that's down by the lake. They have their big garage when you just come down the hill. There's a big stone garage. That's all CCC work. And they were also working at the hatchery. Freddie did some of that, Freddie Leash. Walter Hooverman, who lived just up the road from the hatchery as it got up closer to St. Croix Falls. They tore out all the wooden flumes, poured cement, and they were all cement raceways after that. The cement that the WPA guys put in was really solid. Because of the springs, the ground didn't freeze hard or heave up. So the slots in the raceways that hold the screens, where they drop in, they're still accommodating the screens today. If they have to repair a wall, they can still use the same footers. There was a beautiful spring just off the left side of this picture, and the water was crystal clear and cold, always 48 to 52 degrees, never froze. They dug around it and built a big box with about a 6-inch pipe sticking out, put pea gravel in the bottom, and that would fill up with that clear, cold water. Sonny remembers, we used to swim in the flumes as kids. When it was 85 or 90 degrees, it felt so good to flop into that 48-degree water. Losi would yell, "Stay out of those fish." So this is the fish hatchery. Notice that the raceways go all the way across. It's just one after the other. Not anymore. In the middle, there were the 2 more raceways, but at some point they were filled in. And that exposed tube, the black metal one that you see right here, runs from just behind me, where the spring comes out of the hill, all the way down into the rearing house. And that is what feeds the trays in there, the tanks in there. And the deer love it out there because it doesn't freeze and they can come and eat watercress whenever they want to. So it's not all beautiful and fun at the hatchery. There are some occupational hazards. This little house was the meat house or the pellet shed, and what the fish ate at that point was beef liver, that's unfit for human consumption, herring and other rough fish, canned carp, pork spleens, and byproducts of poultry packing plants. The 1935 building was called the meat house because that's where they prepared the fish food. Adolph Pepper did most of the grinding, and his fingers were chopped off. He lost 3 fingers in it. So they got meal from the mill and gallon containers of canned carp and big boxes of liver, and Adolph would grind and mix that, and that's what they fed them. Adolph would have been Laverne Rensby's dad, if anybody knew Laverne. The story goes that because of the propane heater in there, one day Louis was going in, lit up a cigarette, and was literally blown backwards out of the shed. I gotta wonder. This here is the grinder, so that's what Adolf would have been using. I think it's neat that's still there. This other little shed is the food storage building, and the Wisconsin Historical Society has it listed as being built in 1935. It is possible that it's one of the original cottages that was moved down the hill. Not very big. And again, not all fun and games. In 1936, a flood swept away the state fish hatchery and caused $125,000 in damages, washing 1.5 million trout into the stormy river. A foot of snow followed by heavy rains tore out the dam and the reservoir pond down the hill. Put the powerhouse out of commission, and it was estimated that it would take 4 or 5 years to get everything back up to speed again. The hatchery was one of the largest in the state and was the pride of both the department and the sportsmen, and the loss to fishermen could not be estimated. That's another shot of the water going over taking out the house. The Osceola Sun reported that hatchery workers had worked into the wee hours of the morning, filling and placing sandbags to try to protect the powerhouse and dam. But suddenly, about 2:30 Tuesday morning, while the men were at work, suddenly there came a roar and a wall of water came down the creek. Mr. Stewart shouted to the men who were on top of the dam, and they scrambled to safety just in the nick of time. Louis Leash was the last to escape, and he barely made it. The west side of the dam was washed away. 525,000 trout were saved by moving them to the main hatchery house. The fish were badly crowded in there. They could survive for a little while. The main yard and all the raceways there were underwater. There were fish everywhere. Sorting all the ages and sizes of fish back into their proper tanks was going to take a very long time. The hatchery, incidentally, was not the only place to suffer. Osceola downtown also flooded out because Osceola Creek flooded. We don't have to worry about the river so much being up on the bluff, but the creeks flooded. Washed out the lower end of Cascade Street and the swimming pool, which I'm assuming was the mill pond, if anybody knows, because I don't think we've ever had a swimming pool. It flooded the Anderson Lumber Company yard and the surrounding area. They said maybe if they had taken the floodgates out a little sooner, it would have saved something, but they didn't want to risk losing all the fish into the river, so they waited, and then they were frozen and stuck, and they couldn't get them out. The water ran down Main Street, cutting deep ravines along the gravel edges of the blacktop, washed over the sides of the glen, cutting gullies and covering the steps under more than a foot of water. Ernie Dodd's business, which is where the watershed is now, didn't flood, but the water was up to the top of their steps. So you'd never know any of this to look at it now. If you go out there now, it's this lovely green field. This shot was taken from near where the dam and the rearing house likely stood, the first one. It's like if I'm standing with my back to the dam, looking over toward S. It's just this lovely field with a little creek running through it. Hasn't been that way in a long time, not since Samuel Close dammed it up. The land, right behind me then, that's where the land drops off. The other picture is from the opposite end of the field, looking down, and where you see the little V toward the back, that's where the dam goes down. So after you cross S and go down through the gate at the Osceola Loop, they have the 2 loops out there now, the hiking trails. You go down the Osceola Loop, head straight down the river. There's actually an old hatchery road that goes down, very easy walking, little boulders along the side. Theoretically, it's probably started out as the Native American trail that we talked about as an easier way to get up from the river. It's pretty overgrown out there now, but off to the left you can find this field. They think that there was probably more water running in the creeks at that time because they got a lot of power out of what was coming through. Now it's a pretty placid little stream. So by 1937, they're continuing. They've got the new garage that we showed you before, and they have got their new oxygenated tanks on the truck. So when they're hauling fish to stock them, they had previously been hauled by train in big cream cans, which was fine. It worked. They were round. They kept the fish from sloshing against each other and getting hurt. But somebody had to ride with them and scoop water back and forth to keep the water oxygenated, or the fish would die. Then they could just dump them sometimes right from the train into the water. So as soon as these fish left the hatchery, got stocked where they were going, employees at 31 of the institutions in Wisconsin started all over filling tanks and trays and jars with new eggs. It's a very seasonal job. Muskies and panfish were added to some of the hatcheries. They didn't bring muskies here. And the state tourism folks were excited. They were advertising to all the other states to come here and fish because it was such great fishing. So that's 1938. You can see they've closed in those two raceways in the middle. WPA was still working there, and they built the 6-car concrete garage. They constructed a loading dock and a new ceiling for the main hatchery building. The blocks were actually made on site by the WPA workers, and several old unsightly buildings, including the old ice house, were torn down. There was a sand pit on site that the WPA guys used, and it's up kind of behind where the house is now. They worked all through the winter in tents. The guys would dig the sand up on the hill, hand mix it with cement, haul it in wheelbarrows. It was all local people, and they had a small dump truck out behind the house. The crew painted, cleaned out an acre of flowage, rebuilt 2 concrete dams, laid 800 feet of pipe, graded and surfaced 2 miles of road, improved and sodded 3,000 feet of bank, and constructed 2,500 feet of raceways, and installed 1,000 rods, a rod is 66 feet, of woven wire. They cleared 10 acres of land surrounding the hatchery and planted 1,000 white pine seedlings. Fred Steffen, who was a local contractor, I believe, dismantled the resort hotel and used the materials in the construction of the new hatchery building, which includes an office and a fish food storage room. And also in 1938, a new bass pond was to be constructed. All the other hatcheries were to be completely repaired. A drainage ditch 6 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and 2,640 feet long would be constructed, and the grounds re-landscaped. They were keeping themselves occupied. This is where the sand pit used to be. It's also just a field now. At one point, they used to use a lot of the sand there to repair and replace public water accesses, but somebody had the idea to dump some old concrete there, and now it's contaminated, so they can't use it for that. So that would have been okay. Lots of people living up in the neighborhood there. Adolph Pepper lived in a house across the road from the hatchery, next to the creek where it runs under the road there. Freddie Leash was working at Hayward. Lundquists had bought the Fredine farm, and Osceola Creek ran right through there. Schilbergs came in from out of the area. They were new to farming. They didn't milk at the same time as the other farmers, so that kind of raised some eyebrows, but they seem to have done okay with it. Johnny Brosnahan, also known as Brushingham's, bought the McCarty farm. He was a bachelor and lived there with his sister. Louie and Freddie were going to the Riverside School. National Park Service actually now has that little school building. They use it for some of their lab work, right? Yep. Let's see. If you turned off County Road S and went up towards Dresser, Emil Frank lived below the hill. Herman Hansen was way up the road past where Suzzler's was. Lindahl's is still Lindahl's today. They're a Century farm. The Clarks had their farm up there, and then you were up to the reservoir, the Dresser Sewer Pond. Grandpa Leash, Louie's dad, he lived just off of S, and Ronnie Hooverman's family still lives in the little house there, and I'm not sure if that was where Grandpa Leash's house was. I'm not entirely sure on that one. Coxie Johnson was a neighbor. Where the vet was part of the Leash farm, and I think, let's see, the lads owned right up to the hatchery property at this point. Bob Brown's house was the border, and it cut across behind Emil Frank's, dropped down over the hill, and Bob Brown bought the land there before the National Park Service came and prevented you from doing that anymore. People could still hunt down there if they had some connections with the hatchery, so that was kind of nice. Your own private spot. Hooverman's house would have been Lawrence Hooverman Sr. and his family were in the house that Adolph Pepper had been in. They moved in there. Did I miss a? Nope. Adolph's kids were Jerry, Vince, Violet, Audrey, and Laverne, and Yvonne. And Sonny remembers when they lived at the hatchery, walking across the field to play with them. He was just recovering from pneumonia, having almost died. And all this construction was going on when he was about 10 years old. So, when out-of-town relatives would come to visit, Hoovermans would take them over to the hatchery to see it. It was so pretty. These are some of their pictures that they took just having the tour. However, in 1939, hatcheries across the state were known to be outstanding beauty spots. Some of them had formal landscaping. They were very, very nice. But there was enough trouble with people sneaking in at Osceola to fish that they had to put up a 6 to 8 foot high chain link fence with barbed wire surrounding the property to keep the people out. That's gone now. I like this picture. You can see the little hole in the side there that the arrow's pointing at. In the raceways, the water actually gains force as it goes along because of all the springs that feed into it. So you can just kind of see them in there. We got up to World War II, and this is interesting. If you look at Adolph Pepper's draft card or registration card, they ask if you have any identifying, tattoos or scars or anything. It mentions that he's missing 3 fingers off his left hand. Mr. and Mrs. Losey Stewart, who were located at Spooner, he became the area supervisor over all the hatcheries. Adolph Pepper was registering for the draft. I was told that when Lawrence Hooverman was drafted, he was kept back by the state. I don't know if that means he was like an essential employee like we have now, but he did not have to serve. But he had come to work as well. Jim Hooverman, one of his sons, said he thought that Dad and Losey Stewart pretty much took care of the lower battery and the powerhouse down there, the power dam. Okay, but Louis Leash was drafted in 1942 in December. Sonny was 14 and his brother Rodney was 9. About the same time, the hatchery discontinued their housing, so Ruby Leash and the boys had to find some place to live. They lived with relatives part of the time, and part of the time they were in one of Ernie Dodd's cabins down on the mill pond. Since the resort season was closed in the winter, they could stay there in the winter, and Dodd's kind of looked after the boys. Of course, Ruby had to do something to make a living, so let me see where this is. Sorry, I lost my spot. She would detassel corn. Then they started making the dry packs, the ration packs for the war down at Doughboy in New Richmond. So a bus would come from Centuria and to St. Croix and stop at Osceola and pick up people. They'd come about 2 in the afternoon, take the workers down there. They'd get home again about 2 in the morning. So she was doing everything she could to keep the family together while the dad was away. Sonny remembered he was at school one day and his cousin Billy had gone downtown, and he came back and said, "Sonny, I think your dad just came home." And Sonny said, "I left school right then and caught him at home." He had to hitchhike to get there, which just is so foreign to me. Now when people come home from service, everybody's meeting him at the airport, and it's a big deal, and poor guy had to hitchhike. So in the 40s, this is Lawrence Hooverman, and this is the house that Adolph Pepper would have lived in first, and then the Hoovermans were there. That house did not get moved out. The Hoovermans would have moved in like in 1946 or so. There was no electricity, no running water for a long time. When they did get it, it was cold, so they all had to bathe in the creek, which we know is about 52 degrees. The kids here in the picture are Vera, Vonnie, and Jim Owen, Kenny and Nancy Hooverman, Dick Owen, and Ronnie Hooverman. Kelly Swanson was, I think, another employee of the hatchery. He lived by Herman Hansen up on the road going up by Hope Church. Grandpa Leash owned all the way up to Selzler's on that point, and they hauled wood out of the woods to burn there. On the land next to the Hooverman house, another conservation department employee owned some land. He came down from Hayward about once a year and allowed the local farmers to cut wood on his property. They had to haul it out in the winter using horses because it was too steep and swampy in the summer to get it out. And the poor horses would have their noses almost to the ground as they were hauling the wood up the hill. Nancy remembers the battery down below the hill being a big building where the fingerlings were kept, but there was an old foundation next to that. She remembers riding in her dad's fish truck, the particular smell of it, probably the ground up liver mixed with fish pellets. And she remembers her oldest brother, Lawrence Jr., Larry, who worked at the hatchery later, carrying her when they walked down because she was too little to cross the creek. Bessie Hooverman, who was Nancy's mom, she also did her part. She was one of the sky watchers for World War II in the Ground Observer Corps. These women were trained, well, and men too, to watch the skies. It's kind of like bird watching. You can recognize them by the shape of their wings. They could tell what kind of planes were flying over, and they kept track of that. They were actually put out of business when the radar base came into town. But up until then, that was how they did it. There was another house out there. The circle is where the Hooverman house was. The little question mark, I think, is Alfred Metzger's. If anybody knows, let me know, because we're not real sure on that one. He does have a daughter who's still living. I believe she's about 77. And in this picture, you can see S is the road coming through here. That's the long raceway over at the hatchery, this other long stripe. But now we're getting into some modernization. Now the trout get their food from the icebox. Food freezing facilities were a big deal. That meant that trout in Wisconsin are eating better and at less cost to the state. Storage rooms in Osceola and several other hatcheries were large enough to hold a train car load of supplies, and others had units large enough to hold a 2-week supply. The compartments were finished over the summer and allow the department to make purchases when they want to, buy in volume, cut down on spoilage, and to reduce transportation costs, and to eliminate the need to buy ice. 2,000 cakes of ice had been cut by hand from the upper mill pond each winter and stored in the ice house at Troutmere. And in 1950, the Wisconsin Conservation Department is stocking legal-sized fish these days, rather than just fry, and finding that it's paying off. It costs considerably more, but the trout stream improvement plan that had been in place for a few years aimed to make the whole stream into good trout habitat instead of just the little pockets of trout that they had been doing. They did have to work with farmers to get them to not let their cattle graze right down to the water's edge if they could find some way around it. But they said they did have to be tolerant of people who couldn't afford to change that. This is the lower battery. They were experimenting with a new strain of rainbow trout that's less likely to run away. So they're putting them in the whole stream, but they used to just disappear from where you dropped them. These ones were more likely to stay put. Historically, they planted more brook and brown trout because they stay put better, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife offered these particular trout to the states, and Wisconsin accepted. So they were put in Osceola Creek, Little Brule, and other places in the state. The production schedule at that time called for the release of nearly 1,200,000 yearlings. 3,500,000 trout fingerlings will also be stocked, and about 6 million trout eggs as well. And the principal trout production plants of the state are at Osceola, where the state hatchery turned out 120,000 yearlings last year, among others, and at Wild Rose, where 260,000 of the catchable trout were produced for plantings. In June of '52, The Osceola Rod and Gun Club was a cooperating hatchery, or cooperating agency for work on Osceola Creek, and the club worked on fencing, stream bank planting, and channel improvement. And landowners were doing their required work. Now notice how many windows are in that building. Keep that in mind for later. This was a bad day. There was another home out by the Hoovermans, and the hatchery there belonged to Robert Carlson. And their house stood between the Hooverman house and the first set of rocks there on S. It was going to be moved into Dresser. And the movers told the Carlsons they didn't have to do a thing. They could just leave everything as it was. If they left a glass of water on the table, it would be there when they got to Dresser. And it was not. They hit a soft spot on the side of the road, dumped the house into the creek. The first one's kind of a double exposure taken from the corner of the Hooverman house. The second one is a kind of a bad newspaper picture, but you can see it did not go well. This is a little bit better. So the boys would find toys and china and all kinds of stuff in the creek for a long time afterwards. People came out from the cities to see this. This was entertainment, so yeah. I love this picture. Leon D. Johnson wrote a story called The Spawn Takers for the 1953 Wisconsin Conservation Bulletin. He said the spawn takers are rugged individuals, strong for heavy work, yet with a knowledge and special skill that enables them to remove eggs from trout and impregnate them with milt from the male without injuring them in any way. Hands must retain their feel for the trout, even though they're numb from hours in icy waters. I like this. This one's cool. Jeff says they still seine the same way, but the poles are now aluminum rather than the hand-carved wood that they were using in the other picture. This is Lawrence and Louis Leash. And in 1954, Nancy shared this picture of her father, Lawrence, who they called Slim, and Sonny Gross and Arvo Sari are the other two, school-educated young guys who came to the hatchery in 1950. She remembers that there were ropes crisscrossed above the fish so the guys could crawl up in the netting and rest if they had to, if they were out doing the heavy work. The nets are still there. The seines are hung upstairs in the rearing house, just as they've always been, filtering the light that shines in from the big windows that look out at the raceways. You can see the black netting over the tanks intended to keep out the marauding herons and hawks and raccoons, mink, otters. The little chair that sits there is without a single nail. It's all pegged together. It's been there for a very long time. This is Adolph Pepper. He retired after 33 years of service. Having worked faithfully and well at his appointed tasks, received respect from his fellow employees, and given competent stewardship to his trust from the people of Wisconsin, which I think is really cool. Not too long after this, hatchery switched over from the ground fish food to fish pellets that contained protein, vitamins, and minerals and other ingredients. The fish were found to thrive, and the cost of the pelletized food was significantly less. Lots of things are changing. In 1960, Losi Stewart also followed him into retirement. He'd started at Wild Rose in 1921, opened the Westfield Hatchery in about 1923, moved to Hayward in 24 to oversee the start of construction, then went back to Wild Rose, and then he came to Osceola in 1928. By the time he left, Osceola was the largest breeder of brook trout in the state and ranked far up in the nation in brook trout egg production. There were 5 full-time employees. They fed over 108,000 pounds of fish food in a year. And then Henry Larson transferred in from Hayward. When Losi left, the newspaper people asked him some of his memories, and he recalled that he did his first trout fishing on the White River in Washara County in 1905. He stocked the stream with 1,700 legal-size rainbows. He said he was uncertain how many trout he caught on his first attempt, if any, but he's certain that he's put back more than he ever took out. Willard C. came in, let's see. Don Olson first came in 1960 to work at the hatchery. Willard C. was the manager, and Willard was employed for over 25 years by the Department of Natural Resources. He'd been in the Army Infantry in World War II, and with the exception of the last 3 months of his life, Willard spent the last 43 years in the Osceola and St. Croix Falls area. He retired in '76 and died in 2004. Glenn Keller then joined the ranks in 1965 as hatchery foreman. He stayed until '97. Kathy C., Willard's daughter, remembers, yes, there was a road on the west side of S across from the hatchery property. There was a building at the bottom of the hill near the river that had tanks for the young fish. It was bigger than the building up by our house. It's all torn down and you'd never know it was there. They had to go down there twice daily to feed the fish. There was also a dam just above it, so there was a pond. Beaver liked to move in there. Let's see. She had mixed feelings about the new trails going in. She said, I was sorry that the area was opened up to the public because I had it all to myself. In the winter, only my footprints showed up in the snow. I kept track of the deer herd. I could lay on a log above the creek and listen to the water and think of the natives doing the same. Now it's not so private anymore, but it is nice that everybody else can get in there. And this is when Lawrence retired in 1966. His daughter Nancy took these pictures as he was feeding the fish one more time. Lake Hallie by La Crosse, right? Towards La Crosse. I don't know what it is, but those people down there get really excited about their fish. Every year in the paper, they have stories about the Lake Hallie Sportsman's Club helping to stock them. So a reporter for the Chippewa Herald Telegram gushed in April of 1967, I'd never seen so many trout packed almost solidly together. They arrived north of Bloomer in a tank truck driven by Arvo Sari, driver for the Wisconsin Fish Management Hatchery at Osceola. There were 2,500 brook trout in the truck tanks, all of a legal size, and a great number crowding 10 inches. It was quite a job for just the game warden and the hatchery men to plant the whole truckload of trout alone. Each 5-gallon bucket they handled held from 50 to 60 trout, a pretty good load to carry up and down steep banks and over boggy ground. The warden said he once spilled 2 buckets full of trout on the ground. It took some scrambling and pawing, he said, to get those trout back in the pails. The pictures above are from 1971 and 72, but they are representative of the kind of work that went on. In 1952, Larry Hooverman, after serving in Korea, came to the hatchery under Mr. C's leadership. His son Matt remembers good things about hatchery life as well. He says, I can remember how Kathy felt about the battery. It was kind of a magical place. I remember going down there, as she mentioned, twice a day to feed the fingerlings. At the time, the area was very restricted, and there was a locked gate, and the building was locked. It was very secluded. I never saw the house that the older Hoovermans had lived in, but my dad told me about it. They had to bathe in the creek. I can only imagine how cold that must have been. There's a lot of family history along that road for sure. I guess I was lucky to get in on some of it. This is fun. Louis Leash also retired, and in the fall of 2001, Sonny donated his father's Wisconsin Conservation Department fish management jacket to the hatchery, where it currently hangs in the manager's office. So between the three of them, they had almost 150 years of combined service. Several years are shown in these slides, but those Lake Hallie sportsmen sure got excited. They showed up every April to help, and the newspapers covered it every year. Notice that Lee Haas is working at the Osceola Hatchery now. On the one on the right, they had a school group come out and help them stock the trout to see what was going on. Hard enough to walk up and down a stream bank without carrying a bucket full of fish. Stocking the fish really doesn't change too much, but there's been some experimentation going on. For several years, starting in the very late 60s, Chinook salmon were also raised at the Osceola Hatchery and planted in the Great Lakes. They also tried out a floating fish pond, which was a floating portable release raceway in Lake Michigan. Newspapers reported that a big aluminum cage, 10 by 40 by 3 feet, deep near Sturgeon Bay, would be a temporary home for about 68,000 of those salmon fingerlings waiting at Osceola. They would stay there for 2 weeks where they would imprint, so they'd remember where to come back to when they spawned. Then the pond is broken down into 20-foot sections and used to hold other fish elsewhere. The warm water discharge from nuclear power plants over there would be great spots to overwinter fish, to permit rapid all-season growth of walleyes, catfish, and any other species raised for stocking in waters elsewhere in the state. Eventually, it was decided, though, that a hatchery closer to the Great Lakes would make more sense, and Osceola went back to focusing solely on trout. And here's Lee Haas. He was promoted to foreman after Willard C. retired in 1975. At that time, there were 4 permanent and 1 part-time employee at the Osceola location. Lee had already spent 7 years at St. Croix and 2 more in Osceola. An electrical update project improved the facilities that year, although the hatchery had to be closed to the public for a couple of weeks. And these are just a couple of aerial shots. That's the main yard. You can see the garage and the house and the ponds there. And this one is farther up. It's kind of looking the other way. You can see the long raceway with the pond at the end, and you can see the creek that goes all the way down to the river. There are stringent requirements for the water that goes through the hatchery and into the St. Croix. Almost 2 million gallons a day from about 39 wells, or 39 springs, and it's critical for the entire ecosystem that they meet those standards. If you happen to see yourself or someone you know in these pictures, I would love to know who they are. 5 to 7 employees was pretty normal at this time. When there was downtime with the fish, there was brush to cut and maintenance projects or a mile of raceways to clean. And that cleanliness earned them a Class A rating at Osceola. Mark Gottwall came on staff during the late 70s. Doug Marlowe was there from 1989 to 99. Vince Kobernick started at the Spooner facility in 1990, then joined the Osceola crew in 2000. And in the fall, they're back to stripping eggs. More than 1 million eggs are produced each year, far more than could be raised here. So many are sent to other hatcheries around the state, and some are traded to out-of-state locations. The fish are anesthetized before stripping them, so the process isn't traumatic. They're slipped back in the cold water, and that perks them up again, and life is good. Inside the rearing house, it's very dark, and you can hear the water running again, and there's these little jars of orange stuff. Those are the eggs. Back in the day, the rearing houses, remember we saw where it had all the lights and skylights and everything? We found out that wasn't a good thing. Trout need darkness and shadows. So any of the windows that aren't filled in are pretty much covered up. And it's all painted in industrial gray, which was left over from the war originally and still is. The water runs through these little jars just like it did through the trays that Louis was working with. The hatchery achieved 90% eye-up last summer, which is 200,000 eggs. The white ones you see in the jars are dead ones, and they have to be picked out with the little tweezers. Hanging in the same spot they've been for decades. Those little tweezers and the chart taped on the wall have to be counted by hand into this little trough. Between 30 to 45 eggs in a line in the little trough. 30 means that you're going to have 8,000, over 8,000 in a quart. So in the rearing house, you've got rows and rows and rows of fish in tanks. That hasn't changed much either, except the tanks used to sit flat on the floor, so the guys had to bend over to tend to them. And if you can see right here, that is this tube that comes in and runs between them. Mr. Haas figured out how to raise the tanks up, get that water to come in, and then they didn't have to bend over and work anymore. Also in the 70s, the fry pond was reduced in size. It used to be a lot bigger. It's between the raceways and where the house sits. These little troughs on the side of the building are not used anymore. They used to sort the fish down, the males in one, ripe females in another, other females down the third. And again, with the trout needing shade, They're out in the open raceways, but when they are spawning, there's a little tin shed there, so they have a little gazebo that they can go into. The raceways are continuous. They wind around like a queue at Disney World and broken up only by the screens that we talked about before. If they were all straight, like that last section is, they'd be over a mile long. And at the end of the long straightaway, you come to the effluent pond, where those gallons of water end up. And still clear and cold, they filter down into the creek and flow down to the river through the field that Samuel Thompson flooded and Gustav Hansen tended. These are all the known employees that I've come up with. If anybody has more, please let me know. A lot has changed since Samuel Close first settled on the creek and since Troutmere beckoned to the society folks. But a lot is the same. The crystal clear water with the gravelly bottom, the wind in the pines, the rhythm of the seasons. As Jeff says, the current supervisor, this place leaves its mark on you. It makes you want to stay. And there are stories that sometimes you might see a man in the old garb walking along the great raceways as if feeding the fish. Coming home late one evening, a couple of staff saw a lantern bobbing around outside the rearing house, but upon investigation, they never could find any sign of anyone. They figure it's probably Louis. So, and that's all I have. Anybody have questions? Hi.
Does anyone know if there were local trout, or were they all brought in? Or they're actually, that strain of trout in the streams locally?
The one, originally they were local trout. There are some heritage species that are brought in, ones that have never been mixed with other trout.
We still collect trout from the South Fork of the Hay River and bring them to the hatchery, the eggs, and release those.
Okay.
But mostly it's a captive food stock of their own rainbow trout that we raise right now.
Sure.
So we just have this domesticated line that we keep on site and raise them up 3 years. We mix our 3-year-old females with our 2-year-old males and keep the lineage going.
Okay. Oh, cool.
Those come from Tennessee through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service originally. Those are rainbow trout.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you very much. I should mention next month, May 2nd, we're going to do our next program. It's going to be on the Wyman Ladd Horst property up on the hill. It's going to be held up there. You do have to register because space is limited. Not a fee for it, but we just have to make sure we have room for everybody. So kind of be watching for that.
And the registration will be up on the Facebook page. So,
Okay.
as soon as I get it up there.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
And again, his brochure is here, membership's here, and we'd love to have you join us. We'd love to have you tell us stories that you know of the area. Help us do research. They're doing archiving projects with scanning all the photos that are that they've got collected over the years. Lots of things going on, and if that's not enough, then you can join us with the Mount Hope Cemetery. On Wednesday nights, we clean stones up there, get the moss and the dirt off that. So the Historical Society is very busy and would love to have other people get involved with us. And with that, let's give Barb another round of applause.
Just say you know more than you think you do, so share it with somebody. Like,
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank
and
you,
if you
Jane.
didn't sign in when you came in, please sign in now.